Spy Cops Info Podcast, looking at the undercover secret political police that infiltrated Britain's activist movements. Episode 4, The Undercover Policing Inquiry, Tranche 1, Phase 2.
Hello and welcome to the Spy Cops Info Podcast, Episode 4. I'm Penny.
I'm Chris.
Welcome, and today we're going to talk to you about what's been going on with the Undercover Policing Inquiry. We're going to talk. We're going to have a few more in-depth interviews, sort of summarising what's gone on, talking about all the events and things with our roving reporter Tom, who's been in London this week. But before we do that, we're going to give you sort of a bit of an overview of some of the highlights about what's happened in the inquiry so far.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had time for an overview, but really it's just a brief mention of a few of the things. So we've had a number of civilian witnesses who've been given evidence to the inquiry since it started on Wednesday, 21st of April. They've included Madeleine, who is the first woman who's given evidence who had a relationship with an undercover. She talked about the betrayal that she felt, not just personally, but to her comrades as well. And then we had Diane Langford speaking as well, who was involved with a variety of groups, including the Women's Liberation Front. She spoke about how a friend of hers recognised the undercover from his real life, so to speak, and challenged him. And then he was said to have threatened her.
And threatened her family as well, I believe. Is that right? Yeah. He denied this, but this is, again, the recollections that seem quite clear for people. So then we have Dave Morris, who was part of the Anarchy Collective based in London in a sort of a house commune, and there were kids present. He doesn't remember the specific undercover officer. However, he did note that they sort of reported on families and things, which again felt like a big intrusion. Yeah,
then we had Dr. Norman Temple giving evidence. He was a member of the Irish National Liberation Solidarity Front.
Which, just for future reference, that will come up a few times in this show, and it's often referred to as the INLSF. So if you hear that, just because it doesn't always roll off the tongue, just keep an eye out for that one. And after that, we also heard from one of the undercover police officers, David Robertson, also known as HN45. He infiltrated the Marxist-Leninists and Britain-Vietnam Solidarity Front. He was the officer who was alleged to have had the dispute with Ethel, who was the woman who recognised the undercover police officer and called him out.
And also Alex Sloan, he was the infiltrator to Norman Temple's group.
I think they said also that he had a nickname, was that right?
No, it wasn't his. He let go about a nickname of another undercover, Mike Ferguson, who we'll hear about later as well.
And what was the nickname?
Oh, Gimli, as in one of the dwarves from Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit.
There you go. Also, just to be of note, that Mitting thanked the undercover officers for their honesty and their testimony that day.
It seemed like kind of like prejudging the subject matter somewhat. And then then we had Piers Corbyn, who, as you probably know him, as a climate change denier and a lockdown skeptic. But before that, he was a member of the International Marxist Group and a squatting activist.
Okay, and then we also had Ernest Rodker. He was part of the Stop the 70 tour, an anti-apartheid campaign, and sort of a community organiser over a long time. He's an elderly gentleman now, and he's in ill health, so a statement was read by his son, quite moving in places. He spoke specifically about a miscarriage of justice that is now to be investigated as a result of this. And he's noted also because he's sort of up there for how many undercovers have spied on him. So he has 6 undercovers who have spied on him from the late 1960s to the 2000s, and he's also a founding member of the CND.
Yeah, then we had another defendant in that case, Professor Jonathan Rosenhead of Ernest Rodker's the Stop the 70 tour direct action, known as the Star and Garter case. He he spoke similarly on, obviously he mentioned a lot of about anti-apartheid stuff as well.
And then we also had, part of that miscarriage of justice, or the to be investigated to see if it is one, which it sounds likely that it is Christabel Gurney, with an OBE to her name. She's an anti-apartheid campaigner, also arrested with the two gentlemen that we spoke about just now. It was Michael Scott, HN298, who was also part of the group that was arrested with them, who sat in on some of the legal proceedings and things, which is obviously, I want to say dodgy, but obviously very problematic from a legal point of view for an undercover police officer to sit in on legal hearings like that.
Yeah, that's right. And he also went along with the police's story that whereabouts they were in the car park or whether they were on the road. So he was, complicit in lying as well, because his evidence could have cleared them, because the offence they got charged with, they shouldn't have been.
There you go. Lastly, we have Peter Hain, who was a well-known anti-apartheid activist. And like Ernest Rodker, he's also had 6 undercover officers spy on him throughout over several decades. They spied on him while he was an MP. He was very assertive when he gave testimony. He gave testimony on what he'd experienced.
Yeah.
Okay, then lastly, we're going to speak about...
Kate Wilson's Investigatory Powers Tribunal, and you'll hear Kate speaking in a bit, and I think she uses the acronym IPT. So just to let you know, it was a 10-year-long court case which finally went to trial at this secret court. She's probably a better person to tell you all the details of it, but it rolled around human rights abuses and her relationship with Mark Kennedy and Mark Kennedy's intrusion, as well as actually other undercovers into all aspects of her private life.
Mm-hmm. And I think we did mention we will hopefully speak to her about that if she's up for it at some point as well. So now we're going to go in and listen to an interview a bit more in depth about a summary of the first few days of the Undercover Policing Inquiry. Just to give you a bit of a heads up, I think the sound was all right. Not our best. It was recorded outside in adherence to COVID guidelines, so that's good. However, it doesn't make for the best listening all the time, but we've done our best to tidy it up, so bear with us, because there's some really important and interesting conversations there to help understand the processes that are going on during this Undercover Policing Inquiry. Also, just as these people who we interview are very knowledgeable about it, there's just a few terms that we want to define for those of us who maybe aren't as knowledgeable about all aspects of it inside out. So one of the things they mention is powerbase.info. So Powerbase, it's an online guide to networks of power, lobbying and deceptive PR. So it's definitely worth checking out in your spare time.
Yeah, and there's a specific undercover research group portal where you can see all our profiles of both individual undercovers, as much as we know about them, but also different departments and aspects of the policing units. So, this conversation starts off with my colleague Donal going straight into, I guess, more nerdy aspects, because he's talking about files and the rooms within Special Branch they were kept in. And just to give a bit of context, the registry file system which he's talking about, these are the individual and group files that the Special Branch kept on. I mean, the impression we've got from the small amount of information we have on these files, that pretty much if you were or are a left-wing activist in the UK, you will have a file open on you, pretty much. I guess at some point they closed some of them, but literally there's how many tens of thousands on these files, not just of people who are organisers, but literally if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you went to a meeting or even to the pub, you might find that you have a registry file open on you. And one thing about the Undercover Policing Inquiry, because it's only about specific undercover intelligence, we don't get to see these files, because these files not only include covert intelligence, but I guess open source and other materials. Well, we don't know what, because we're not allowed to see them, but they have all aspects of the police's information on us as activists.
Okay, so here we go.
Welcome to the Spy Cops Info Podcast, Episode 4, the Undercover Policing Inquiry, Tranche 1, Phase 2. Right, so I'm here with
Evelyn Lamarche
from the Undercover Research Group,
Donal O'Driscoll,
also from the Undercover Research Group,
and Carolyn Wilson, who's a core participant.
and part of campaign proposing police surveillance?
Yeah, I am indeed. I think we all are.
Yeah, I think we all are. So, like, we've just had 2 days of the inquiry, and the Investigative Powers Tribunal thing has just finished. Actually, the Investigative Powers Tribunal we'll do in a different episode. So, I think we should just talk about what's happened in the last 2 days of the I guess it's been 5 days of inquiry so far. Some sort of reaction to that. We've had like 2 days of hearings now. The first day was activists, Diane Langford and Norman Temple, and then today we had 2 undercover cops, HN45 and HN347. So I think we'll just talk about that in reverse order. We'll talk about HN347 first, because that was the one we just came out of. What were your impressions of HN347 as compared to what we already knew about and which you can read on the power base?
It didn't add a lot. It just reminds you of how good undercover officers are at forgetting things when they don't want to remember it. They do remember details, but they forget a lot, which you think if they remember the detail, they should have not forgotten about the rest. And I don't know, the morning was different from the afternoon, because in the morning, what was the name of the inquiry?
We had Kate Wilkinson on behalf of the inquiry this morning questioning HN45.
She's got quite a different style to David Barr, hasn't she?
Yeah, and I think definitely people that watched the hearings in November thought that in some ways she did a better job of digging down and actually asking the questions that needed to be asked. And what's become apparent with all of our witnesses so far is that sometimes they've not really understood the question and answered something completely different to what's been asked of them. But yeah, as Evelyn said, there was a lot of situations today where the officers pretended they didn't remember anything, and then suddenly did remember some key details, and it was really unclear what had sparked this new memory in them, in those 10 minutes.
Yeah, and also I think Kate Wilkinson was better at probing, not very effective, but she would, if someone did not understand the question or pretended not to understand the question, she would ask it in a different way and then try it again in a different way. Well, David Barr was still like he was last time, like he just has this list of questions in front of him, and what he used to do was really rattling off the questions, not even listen to the answer. He was slightly better at that now. But still, they've been given too much leeway to not remember things.
In terms of what they do say, though, how different is the impression that 347 gave this afternoon to what people had seen from just reading the information about him, or previously what people might have seen on the power base?
I think the difference is that there's much more detailed stuff that we have found out, stuff that you can read in the witness statement, stuff that you can read if you go through the reports. There's so much more detail there, and you know that they have read those reports as well, so they've had a chance to sort of immerse themselves in those days again. And they just pretend to not remember anything. And also, like, I think it was this afternoon, H347 was member of a group of about, like important meetings, 17 people there, loads of voting going on essential people about, pushing people out of, expelling people out of groups. And he just claimed that he never voted. He didn't vote at meetings like that, and he never voted. And I'm thinking the procedures of those parties and groups were very much like, okay, who's in favor of this, who's not. And then he said, he was asked, how do you not vote? And he said, I just didn't do it. It's like unbelievable, really.
But he was able to remember that despite remembering very little else. But he was also full of himself in the sense that he said, special branch officers are, well educated or something similar, diligent.
And they put a lot of thought and consideration into things before they made decisions.
But at the same chance, they just did what they were told.
They did what they told, but also it was appreciated if they had initiative. So they decided for themselves which groups were important to infiltrate, and on the other hand, they did what they were told.
But on the other hand, they didn't show any initiative when they realised the group they'd been sent to infiltrate wasn't actually worth infiltrating, and there was no necessary reason for doing so, because, as he said himself, that group would have died a death anyway. And so at the point when he realised that group really wasn't worth infiltrating, why did he take the initiative and go back to his senior manager and say, hey, why don't you put me somewhere else now? Cover is established, I could move on to that group instead. That's much more worth, spying on. But he didn't show that much initiative, but he was very boastful about how much initiative these officers showed. So something doesn't match up there.
And also, I think he ended with saying that in hindsight it was a complete waste of time.
Yeah, in the first phase is where they go very proud of the fact that they didn't go near the groups that were actually breaking the law, and so, I wouldn't go near the anarchists because they were throwing stuff, and it's like the whole point is you were sent in to deal with public order. Why are you feeling smug that you stayed with the groups that marched from A to B and thought that was the appropriate way? It doesn't make sense. But I think one of the clear things coming out of the material now is all the MI5 stuff, MI5 and blacklisting, and you're working out who to, because it's all about that state paranoia of reds under the beds. The whole thing about public order keeps coming up as a justification, but it's so clear on the ground how little it actually is relevant. And they're resorted to using explanations such as, well, we eliminated that group from our things. And it goes, what, you eliminated a group that had political differences to your masters, and you thought the whole reason for going into them is that they thought differently. It's like, how is that not Orwellian?
I was going to say, one interesting thing that has been mentioned, I think, last week in the opening statements, is that some of the documents that are going to end up being published as part of this phase, I'm not sure if they've been published yet, includes fairly regular sort of reports about what is subversion that I think have been originated by the security services and sent out to the police force. And that's going to be really interesting reading when that's published on the Inquiry website. Same as the SDS annual reports are actually really interesting reading, because they give you a sort of overview of how the SDS sought to justify itself every year. And they are available right now, so that's something people can go and look at already.
I think what's interesting about the INLSF, as we should refer to them as, is that they produced a newsletter. Their main thing was the paper, right?
The Irish Liberation Press.
Yeah, and the Irish Liberation
thing for them.
It was a massive thing.
That's all they did.
Right. That's all they did, and they got a specialist undercover officer into their group. And really, what they were doing was producing a newspaper which had a particular sort of rhetoric in it. Which we had the really interesting thing of David Barr quoting at length yesterday. The rant from the paper, and by the end, I was expecting him to check some,
This is where I think the questioning is just utterly irrelevant and missing it. It's not the paper that's important. It's where they were selling it. They're in the Irish pubs in Kilburn. They're going to Coventry. They're going to Birmingham. They're going to Dublin and Belfast.
Dance halls. That's what I found most interesting of all the details today. Time, place to find people. They
were going out, meeting people, making contacts in the Irish immigrant community around the country, trying. And, you got a copper in the middle of that, trying to spot stuff. Now, that wasn't in the reports. Now, if I'm not saying I could ever run a security service, but if I was doing an intelligence gathering operation, that's what I would be asking. And it's like, where is that in the reports? What is so much stuff I'm Irish, I understand the stuff around that. And it's like, there's so much there missing, that's so obvious. It's like, you're out gathering intelligence. The stuff in the meetings, fairly irrelevant. What about everything else? What all the other stuff you had access to? Sorry.
There was a line of questioning that really, when HN 347 started talking about going around the country, going up the M1, going to these places, staying out till 5 a.m. There's things happening there. There's no interest from the inquiry about.
So the things at 5 a.m, you mentioned the dance halls, Caroline, it's like, there will be the illegal shebeens that are going on, where people are talking, where people's tongues becoming loose, where people are whispering in corners, and not even just knowing where those spaces are. That's prime intelligence gathering. Got this myth that intelligence is some sort of esoteric, all-powerful stuff. It is literally day-to-day bits and pieces. Where do they live? Who do they talk to? That's what intelligence is about.
I mean, essentially, I think there's a desire from the Undercover Policing Inquiry to stay away from these kind of topics. But like so much of what this inquiry has like unearthed, particularly when we see like Box 500 and that, it's like the real story is outside of it. And the more narrow we are about the undercover policing, we're not seeing the wider context. We're really losing out what's actually going on, right?
So something that's come up, I think hasn't got any attention, but might do in a future Tranche, is the R squad, or you see in the documents room 892, 894. So there's this unit within Special Branch who are on a separate floor. They're up near the bosses, gathering all the information in from all the different spaces. These are the people compiling material, but it's not just from the undercovers, it's from the phone taps, it's the technical surveillance, it's the walking around. So that's the big picture, that's what's going to the bosses. And then even the police themselves have kind of raised this issue, going, you're only seeing the story at the bottom. What we're not seeing is that level of material, because that's where you see everything in the circle, the actual intelligence that operation decisions are being based on. So there's that huge gap, and MI5 also play a gap in space.
And although the non-state witnesses have all mentioned phone tapping, because I think every activist in that era fully expected that to be happening as a matter of course, the inquiry hasn't actually questioned any of the officers about their knowledge of that, what happened to those records, if they had access to those records, or really talked about that topic at all. And so it's hard then for the inquiry later on to be able to make a comparison between the information they gathered from the phone tapping, the information they gathered from having the undercovers, and therefore were the undercover deployments worthwhile, necessary, and so on. That's one of the things the police have always used to justify placing people so deep undercover in movements, is that's the only way they could get the information. But actually, if they were able to get it in other ways, why wasn't that happening?
It's also the myth of it's also the myth of the silo. That the SDS was totally contained. So you have to look at the information flow and realise there's silos of openings, or silos of doors for stuff to come in and out of.
So one of them today did say that. So one of them today did say that if he wanted information about a particular person or a group, he could just ask the managers or somebody from the back office, and they would bring along that file for him to have a look at. A couple of days later. That was sort of the impression we got. That was interesting.
One of the other things that I noticed is that the activists that are being questioned, or in the hearing, very much about their political beliefs and their ideology and what they wanted to reach. What you can see from that is that the inquiry is very much maybe trying to justify why they spied on these groups.
As the policeman himself said today, when the SDS were collecting intelligence, they were thinking about what groups and what people were doing, but also what they weren't doing. And it's certainly the same with the inquiry. It's the questions that are being asked and the ones that they're not asking. And that's what I think is important to keep track of.
I think to answer Evelyn's point is like admitting an inquiry as a whole is convinced that, and they actually said this in the previous hearing, is that they can get to the truth without us. They believe that on the basis of the interviews and the documents, they can find out information. Us having witnesses from our side in there is icing on the cake. It explains to them what was going on the ground, but they don't believe that we can answer about the deployments themselves, which is naturally nonsense, because the day-to-day, how they actually got into the groups, how they came up and turned up and spoke to people, and how far they were able to get in, only we can answer that, and the undercovers. So, for example, one of the things that came out or was missed today was within the Irish National Liberation Solidarity Front. I've been practicing that.
Oh, good.
Wasn't in the cadre, and the undercover didn't get into that in the cadre. But there wasn't an exploration about or discussion about it, was that somewhere where you wanted to get? Because if you wanted to understand what the group was up to and its genuine true purpose, that's where you would go, because they were clearly the decision makers. He kind of brushed over that, but there's an awful lot of that sort of missing.
They just don't understand what the right questions are. It's so irritating and so.
What we've said to them repeatedly is that they can't ask the right questions of these groups because they've got no experience of these groups.
Yeah.
But I think that there's another element, isn't there, of that it's not just that they don't know what they're doing in that sense, but that they know exactly what they're doing. And for partly because it's an establishment institution, and that what we're talking about, if they're actually going to start asking the real difficult questions, is about attacking, one of the many lines of defence for the establishment, right? So I think that there's an element of them, and also the other part of it, of like the job. I mean, the difficultness of the job. Like, if they start asking us more difficult, they're giving themselves so much more of a job. That what they're giving themselves is a manageable job. It will not get to the heart of anything. I think we all know, right, that it's going to be a whitewash. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I hope you guys enjoyed and learned some stuff from that first group interview. Next, we're going to move on to our next sort of summary of the week and things, so things a little bit further on. So in this interview, people are introduced, but just to make sure you know who's speaking, there's Tom Fowler, who you've heard before on this podcast, Kate Wilson from the PSOOL, Police Spies Out of Lives, Carol and Ben, they're from COP's Campaign Against Police Surveillance. So yeah, have a good listen to that. Thanks.
Hi, we're back from the end of the week of evidence hearings here at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. We've just finished with a full day of Peter Hain giving evidence. There's quite a lot been said. There's quite a lot been covered. Let's get your reactions. Start with Carolyn.
Well, today we've heard all about the anti-apartheid movement. We've had a lot of questioning of Peter Hain about the sort of tactics used by those different demonstrators. And we've also heard him saying repeatedly that he does not think it's acceptable for groups like those to be spied on in this way by such intrusive political policing units.
Katia, what do you think of it today?
I thought it was really inspiring. I followed a little bit the tweeting of yesterday's hearing, where it seems like the barrister for the inquiry basically approached it like she was prosecuting a terrorism trial against anti-apartheid protesters, Professor Rosenthal. And yeah, I was quite put off by that, and I was very inspired to see the way that Peter dealt with it. I think it's worth bearing in mind that obviously his subsequent career and the fact that he is now a member of the House of Lords means that he may have been treated with more respect by the inquiry than some of us can expect, but personally I've been dreading giving evidence, and I'm actually now quite looking forward to it because he's right. Like, we are on the right side of history. The protests that I was involved in back in the 90s are already being shown to be on the right side of history, and yeah, I think it's really important to remember that.
Ray, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting to see the respect given to Lord Hain, but it's also worth pointing out that he was a member of Parliament and a minister, and I think leader of the House of Lords at the point in which he was still being spied on. So that respect by the police themselves didn't extend as far as that. Towards the end, I noted that he talked about how he had personally been spoken to by the head of MI5, who assured him that all the documents on him had been destroyed, and this was quite some time ago.
It was 2000.
And here we are now, that these have been disclosed in evidence, proving that they weren't destroyed at all.
Or if they were destroyed, copies were kept somewhere else.
Yeah.
Whichever way.
I mean, it's interesting. When, like you say, Peter Hain's career obviously has given him all the tools to be able to interact with this inquiry in a way in which maybe a lot of other people haven't found as easy. But I think he was particularly good the way he was as a witness, because he used the opportunity to make the political points that he wanted to make. And I think that maybe some of the other witnesses, no shade on them or anything, didn't use that opportunity. And maybe going forward, we really encourage anybody else who's due to give evidence to the inquiry to really think about ways in which they can get across the points they want to make, because you get the impression that the Council of the Inquiry is not going to be asking you the questions you want to hear. Well, instead, a lot of the huge basis of the focus is on what you were up to made you a legitimate target.
What did you do to provoke them?
Right, exactly.
But I think it's really important, the point that Peter was making about it's really clear now the extent to which the police had lost the plot, and they did and they do consider any kind of left-wing political protest to be what they called domestic extremism. Back in the 70s they were calling it subversion, and it's quite difficult to overcome that narrative. The inquiry have seen the reports that these police officers were writing, and as Peter said, these were officers who were required to justify their own existence, their own salaries, their own jobs, by providing intelligence that said that the left were terrorists, that the left were dangerous, that there was a public order threat, that there was going to be violence, and so they lied. And that the whole system was set up to create that, and we've seen it with the documents that I've seen from Mark Kennedy as well, if an undercover officer came back and said, well, no, they're quite a nice bunch really, I don't think they're dangerous, they'd be out of a job. And also that they would...
As would their whole department.
As would their whole department,
I would point out that Doug Edwards did say that about the Independent Labour Party, and he was told, well, that's a handle to swing, you go back in there and stay the course. One of the things which Peter Hain said today was that the unit started off in the wrong place and continued in the wrong way. And I think that's, one of the things that I remember when we first started looking at all this stuff, we kind of thought the units had evolved a lot over time. What we're getting the impression is there's very little actually changed. That all the problems that were there in the early 70s were there in the 2000s.
Yeah.
I think all they did was develop those tactics further. When they worked out what was effective, then they made more use of techniques that at some point were created.
Yeah.
Whether that's about how they did the cover story and their cover identity, or how they infiltrated groups and the sort of approaches they would make to people.
Yeah, the how changed, but the why never changed.
Well, the name changed as well. So you go through the whole alphabet soup of secret policing organisations, and whenever there's a kind of internal review that draws doubt and points criticism, they just change the name, juggle the letters around, and relaunch it again, and nothing changes.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the points that Peter Hain said, well, there's no special branch anymore, but they haven't gone away. It's not like all these officers are then just kind of given early retirement and then we can do something completely different. They're moved, and that's going to be the case with the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, right?
They're now the National Domestic Extremism Unit.
Right,
they
exactly.
Still exist.
Yeah.
I think another thing
I think they have a new name.
Really, already? Something that Peter raised, which again we saw really clearly in the IPT last week, is the way that these operations went in with an extremely broad remit. They were sent into entire communities to spy on everyone on the off chance that they might get some intelligence about somebody who might actually be involved in crime. I mean, Peter gave the example of spying on the entire Muslim community, but actually, given that the sorts of things we're talking about here are minor criminal damage, if you sent undercover officers into every pub in England, you would undoubtedly find people who committed minor acts of criminal damage on their way home pissed on a Friday night.
But more importantly, you would find people who were criticising the government or slagging off the police, and those would be the people who the police would be interested in spying on, not the drunk person that went out and smashed up the car. Or said that last week I went out and smashed up the car. We have seen the evidence to show that even when undercover officers have been chatting with someone who admits to major criminal damage, that's not been investigated. That's not what they're interested in.
It was very interesting. I thought that Peter brought that up as an example of what would be unacceptable policing. But we know that some of these former spy cops, Bob Lambert for one, went on after his career with the Special Demonstration Squad, all the rest of it, to launch the Notorious Prevent programme, which is exactly about spying on Muslim communities and other people that they suspect there's a risk that some people might turn to some kind of terrorist activity. But they've used it to justify spying on thousands of people and opening files on thousands of people.
Yeah, I mean they're the ones that put Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion on the terrorist list. And yeah, I mean there is massive continuity across these units and the way that they're approaching progressive politics.
One of the things is about the treatment of the far right. We had revealed today for the first time that there were undercover officers in the far right in the 1980s. Apparently there's restriction orders on everything to do with them, so we won't be hearing at all about them.
No, we don't know the quantity either, so at least one.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
We know about more than one because there have been some bits of information leaked over the many years. But yeah, we don't have as much information as we have about the ones that have infiltrated us.
But it's certainly the case that the attitude of these units about the far right was very different. We've had a lot of reference to what was referred to as the Battle of Lewisham, which there was some disorder and violence on that event. There's no two ways about it. The police, though, were entirely interested in what the counter-protesters were doing. They had no infiltration of the far right of the National Front taking place, despite the fact that there was a huge rise in racist attacks at that time. We see this thing much later as well when we have the rise of the EDL, the English Defence League, which the security, the police say were not considered a domestic extremist group, and in fact they encouraged Muslim groups to engage with them. It seems like the attitudes of the police never really changed about the far right, albeit that maybe they decided there was some criminality that they couldn't ignore at some points over time.
I mean, it is now illegal for serving police officers to also join certain far right organisations. And in fact, there was a guy imprisoned, I think, yesterday or today.
No, it was today, 4 years and 4 months.
For that very crime. But in the 70s, I think it was actually quite commonplace for police officers to be fairly overt supporters of the far right groups that existed. And that's no secret. We know that the police are still institutionally racist now, and I think we've all seen the police acting in racist ways much more recently. But I think the problem is actually much worse in the 70s than it is now. It was much more acceptable and to be open about it.
The first authorisation to send Mark Kennedy in to spy on the Sumac Centre specifically targets anti-fascism. And it's interesting because they recognise in the authorisation that there have been some very famous anti-fascists, and I don't know if they actually mention the RAF. And by that I don't mean the Red Army faction, I mean the Royal Air Force in World War II. They then go on to spy in depth on Nottingham anti-fascists, and it turns out that throughout most of Mark Kennedy's operation, the intelligence on Nottingham anti-fascists says that there are 2 members and one of them is him. But they're still focusing on the far left and not on the far right.
As a similar thing goes on with Huntsabs in the authorities, in which the violence around Huntsabbing is raised, but in a way that you would think that what you're talking about is Huntsabs going out and attacking people, which is entirely the opposite thing. They talk about offences, violent offences, implying that it is
violent offences related to Huntsabbing,
when in fact those offences were committed against Huntsabs. So who do you spy on? Do you spy on the Terrier men and the Hunts themselves who are committing these violent offences? No, you go and spy on the Huntsabs.
Yeah, I mean this is something which is really comes through in the line of questioning. I mean, like, to be fair to David Bar QC, the questions he's asking are coming from elsewhere. It's not his line of questioning necessarily. It's been put to him by various sides, but. I mean, one of the things they did put to Peter Hain about the Battle of Lewisham was that the National Front march wasn't banned. It was a legal march. They'd worked with the police, whereas the counter-protesters hadn't worked with the police, and they'd caused the problems. And it's this kind of framing of it all that, like, well, the National Front,
the illegitimate ones,
right? So the National Front are a perfectly legitimate political party. They're rising in popularity in the UK. They're the third biggest party in the UK. Who the hell are these lefties to go and stop the democratic progress of fascism in Britain? And I mean, we have heard all throughout this week, and particularly today, essentially a defence of apartheid South Africa. We've also heard a defence of the British far right at a time when racist attacks were enormously on the rise, when people were genuinely scared for their life for good reason.
People have been killed. And the same with the Huntsab thing. People have been killed for taking part in Hunt sabotage. We forget about that.
I mean, there is. You may see on social media at the moment there was a Hunt Sab who got very, very badly hurt. I mean, the photos are on social media. They are a bit disturbing. I warn you. If you do go look for them, be warned. Yeah. So I mean, once again, though I think today was very interesting in lots of ways, and there was some few bit tidbits of information. The majority of things that we talked about was about the history of radical protest in Britain. It wasn't about the history of undercover police.
Yes.
The inquiry, which is supposedly there to look at the undercover cops, is actually spending its time looking at the undercover cops' targets.
And that's what I think is really important to take away from Peter's, because he's evidently hugely proud of what he did. And I think we should all be hugely proud of what we did. And it's difficult. It's difficult in the face of a narrative coming from the police that says that we are criminals and that we are subversives and that we are terrorists. And this is, I mean, I've heard it said before that the undercover police are fighting an ideological war and they're on the wrong side.
They're on the wrong side of history.
They have no place. The
Again.
police have no place in getting involved in an ideological and a political campaign in trying to undermine democratic processes in the society, because it's really important to remember that protest is a democratic process. Democracy is not going to the polls once every 4 years and voting, and we have to keep pushing that point.
Let's not forget that the only reason we're allowed to go to the polls and vote is because of protest. I mean, the only reason we have things like the weekend is because of protest. The social progress in this country has only come through protest. It's a key part of democracy. Imagine Britain without these movements. And I mean, one of the things that always fascinates me is what kind of Britain would we live in if the undercover police hadn't been deployed when they were?
Yes.
We look at the change in social attitudes that's happened in Britain since 1968 to now, and how much society has lagged behind the social attitudes of the majority of the population. And I think a certain degree of that has to be laid at the door in the way in which undercover police were used to stunt radical movements. I think it's so clear in terms of the apartheid regime, because arguably Britain's support for apartheid South Africa continued for another 20 years after Peter Haines and the Stop the 70 tour. By that point it was universally derided by most sides, yet the British security services were still working hand in glove with the most brutal terrorist fascist racist regime in the world, possibly one of the worst the world's ever seen. They weren't, like, as much as this is talked about in terms of subversion, public order and criminality, what they were actually fighting was ideas. And though they were, I would argue they were never successful in extinguishing those ideas, they blatantly were very successful in slowing their progress.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think we should all remember that. I mean, Peter on a number of occasions mentioned Extinction Rebellion, he mentioned Greenpeace, and climate change is something that is coming for us all, and the undercover policing of the environmental movement set back the struggles on climate change by years, and they are going to have to live with that, and we are all going to have to live with that.
And not just undercover policing, you've got the overt policing and the and changes in the law, and of course this weekend we have the Kill the Bill protests with the threat of more police powers being thrust upon us. So at every stage that needs to be resisted. Otherwise, again, it's a slowing down of what change is inevitable. But the state, the establishment, the Conservatives all want to slow it down and hold on to what they've got.
And I think it bears repeating. We said it earlier on in one of these conversations, but these spy cops were also spying on political parties. We heard about how Peter was spied on right up through his involvement in the Labour Party, becoming an MP, and right up to being a cabinet minister and head of the leader of the House of Commons. The only political party that wasn't spied on was the Tory party.
As far as we know.
Well, as far as we know.
The left of Tory party.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the ideological bias is coming up again and again, and I think it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is not the role of the
And there is something you said earlier. I mean, obviously there's been a lot of bias in terms of the police and their attitude, but this inquiry as well, you said something like oh, to be fair to David Barr, he's just asking a mishmash of questions from all these different sides. The inquiry get to choose which questions they ask and which questions they don't ask. And they could quite easily say to the police lawyers and the designated lawyers working for the former officers, you know, thanks for your questions, we'll consider them, but give them a lot less weight than they give up. I know a lot of our questions aren't getting asked. And we're looking at, you know, these actual deployments, the effect these deployments had, what these officers did. The real experts are the people in the movements who were spied on. They're not the police lawyers.
No.
You know,
we're
we're probably the only people who can help the inquiry actually interpret these documents and these reports. And if we don't get to see them, if we don't get to see our files, it's going to be very hard for the inquiry to ever reach the truth. We've said this all the way through.
And I think people from the IPT experience, I think it's really important to understand that the people raising the questions from the side of the police, certainly in our case, are not the officers involved. And we have a situation here where the Metropolitan Police as an institution has their legal representatives at the inquiry, and many of the spy corps are not represented by that institution and have made it quite clear that they don't have much confidence in that institution. They have their own lawyers, and the Metropolitan Police legal team are not the people who are running these units, and often they don't know how to interpret the documents. I mean, we've seen in the IPT the inability of the legal team to interpret the documents and the refusal of the officers involved to cooperate. So really, you know, it really is the case that the people who have the information and who can properly interpret the documents and understand them are the core participants who were involved in the movement at the time, because the Metropolitan Police as an institution is defending themselves as an institution. They're not interested in getting to the truth.
I mean, I think it really bears repeating that, you know, a great number of the questions that have been asked over this week, they focused in on the same documents repeatedly. Generally, it seems like they've just keyword searched for anything which sounds a bit racy. So violence, anytime any violence is mentioned, including when they're talking about non-violence. It's still been presented to the witness to say, well, is this a true characterisation? And were you trying to be violent? And I mean, to be honest, a lot of the questions were straight offensive, quite frankly. And you know, you have to ask the question that, like, there is something lacking in the morality and the decency of the people who put those questions forward, and for those who think that it's perfectly acceptable to ask them. You know, there's a real problem
I think
there.
it's going to be very interesting when we come to the issue of relationships had by undercover officers. We've touched on it a bit already, but because this idea that in some way there may be a justification for this completely collapses at that point. There is simply no justification for inhumane and degrading treatment, and the police have admitted that those relationships are inhumane and degrading treatment. And I mean, we've, like, as women deceived into these relationships, we've come up against this a lot, and I quite often get asked, well, you know, what were you doing? And I'm never sure whether to answer the question, because on the one hand, like Peter, I am hugely proud of the things that I did, and on the other hand, I don't want to answer the question because I don't want to suggest that what I'm doing is of relevance.
It's victim blaming.
It's the political policing equivalent of were you wearing a short skirt?
Absolutely, but I fear that when we come to that stage, we will get those unacceptable lines being put forward. Kind of almost certainly.
Especially if Rebecca Hummerstone's anything to do with it. I would say it's incredibly disappointing the way in which the inquiry is behaving, but that suggests that at some point I had hope in it. I think we all knew in advance that it was liable to be a whitewash. I think we all thought they would pay a little bit more lip service to the feelings of those who were targeted, rather than treating us like we're all on trial in some way. Well, just another 3 years till we find out, eh?
There's some rare optimism there. It'll only be 3 years. I personally, I'm putting about 5 years, I reckon, before we start that part of the process.
Okay, I'm thinking, the tranche that starts in 1993, we might go on to that in about 2024.
Okay.
That's my guess.
Yeah.
We can take bets from viewers later.
Yeah, if anybody wants to join a sweepstake on when the inquiry will end, we might do that.
On that point about having no confidence in the inquiry, I mean, it's something that I say over and over again because it is incredibly frustrating. But I think it's important to say that, you know, we are the people who are involved in this public inquiry. We've been banging away at it now since 2014. We were calling for the inquiry to happen in the first place. And I sometimes worry that we say that it's not important because, you know, it's clearly, you know, the lines of questioning are tendentious, the bias is evident, and the treatment of core participants is upsetting, and so we're quite vocal about that. But at the same time, I think it is hugely important, the information that's coming out here, and I don't want to give people who are listening the impression that, you know, the inquiry is just a whitewash. I mean, you have to be aware of the bias, but also, like, be aware of the very important truths that are coming out here, and you know, I'm quite proud of that we got this far.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really bears underlining that. I mean, I think I'm probably one of the most guilty for just like kind of saying how fucking awful the inquiry is again and again, and people who watch these videos know that I keep saying that. But you know, I have taken quite a lot out of my life to be here for every day of the inquiry. I haven't done that for no reason. You know, we are learning things from being here. We are drawing attention to the topic in a way in which we were finding incredibly difficult before an inquiry was launched. Yeah. And I'm always reminded of the words of a chap who came over from the Pat Finucane Centre before the inquiry was started, when we had that police and crime conference thing. And he said, well, the best thing that can come out of a public inquiry is another public inquiry, and the best thing that can come out of that public inquiry is another public inquiry. And after three public inquiries, you may get to a point where you're starting to get some information which is actually enough to start another public inquiry that might go somewhere. And I think we need to, I mean, one of the things about, because we keep talking about how long it's all going to take, how like, oh, it's going to be years ahead, oh God. This isn't going to ever end. Yeah. This is never, ever going to end. None of it's going to end. I mean, if it does end, it's because climate change gets so out of control, we all just fucking burn. Yeah. But like, other than that, it's not going to end. And we shouldn't be like kind of thinking, oh, well, we could really do with it being, it needs to be come to an end soon and hurry up with it, because there is no ending. There is no final battle. You know, I mean, like, we've just got to keep going, and like we'll keep finding things, and we'll keep complaining about things, but we're not going away. Yeah.
This inquiry ends with the MPIOU, but the Spy Cops didn't end with the MPIOU. They're out there now with a different name.
Well,
so will be another.
Actually, I mean, so members of the inquiry have said repeatedly over the last few days that will end with the MPIOU. However, Tranche 5 is supposedly about other undercover police units, not the Special Demonstration Squad or the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. So, you know, the inquiry is in direct conflict with its own terms of reference at the moment, which is, apart from being shameful, is also bloody unprofessional. I mean, I don't know how on earth these people get paid so well to do a job badly. But, like you say, you know, this inquiry it's only a step. And it's a step that, you know, we're going to exploit as much as we possibly can and push it as far as we possibly can, but it doesn't end there. However, this probably does need to end, because we've been doing it for about nearly half an hour now. Is there anything else anybody wants to say before we wrap up? No. Okay. Thanks for joining us.
Kill the Bill.
Kill the Bill on Saturday. They're all over the country. There's one here in London, which I think most of us will be going to. But like, go to the one in your local town. There's lists about the place. I'll try and put something in the comments. Other than that, we'll be back on Tuesday. I forget what's on Tuesday. Actually, I haven't looked that far ahead. But yeah, 10 a.m. Tuesday morning. We'll be tweeting.
Insensitive questions from David Barr, probably.
I can pretty much guarantee there'll be insensitive questions from David Barr. But yeah, we'll see you all then. Check out the hashtag SpyCops. There'll be a new episode of the SpyCops Info podcast over the weekend, hopefully. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Great, so thanks for listening to that. Again, another gem of an interview done by Tom Fowler from our podcast. So that's it for this week. We're going to have more stuff coming to you very soon.
To find out more about this topic, please visit spycops.info, where you can find all the old episodes, subscribe to our newsletter, join our Facebook group, and a lot more besides. We're grateful to the Campaign Opposing Police Surveillance for their support, which has allowed us to buy some microphones. We want to improve more. If you'd like to support the podcast, please get in touch.